Is this on? Or yeah, it's on. Okay, good. Should we still have a few minutes, I guess. So. Okay. Okay, so welcome, welcome to this session. So my name is Serjan Shapkun, and I'm actually presenting in this session. Ahmad, who I guess is somewhere outside, invited me to give a talk, and I was happy to come here and to present. And so thank you all for coming. And I know there are a lot of interesting people out there that you could talk to at this point in time. There's coffee and cake outside, and you're still here with me. So I guess it's a sign of confidence. So I'll start with this. very kind of practically obvious statement, but maybe people don't think about it that much. Maybe if you're in a world of, maybe when you think about it and when you read it, it sounds kind of scary that practically anyone can essentially run code on your system, and not only run code on your system, but can also launch new connections to other systems from your system, can also these days even engage some wireless interfaces on your system. But I would say running a code and also launching an internet connection is practically a given. And now you would, if you think about it a little bit, you would understand what I'm talking about. Obviously, it's if you run a browser and you go to a website, this website can serve you with any kind of code. Well, not any kind of code, but some particular code that can open connections and that can run on your system. And so the question that somehow I and a couple of years ago we asked ourselves with actually someone in the audience here, Ghassan from NEC now. So we asked ourselves, okay, how can we somehow abuse this particular issue? So we can talk about use or abuse, right? And it will become later a little bit clear why I'm trying to discuss this. So how can we leverage somehow the fact that whenever you visit a site, code will be executed in your browser and could be somehow used to do something. It might be something useful or less useful. So in 2011, we published this paper at WWW where we thought, okay, if I can run code on your machine while you are browsing my site, maybe instead of serving you with advertisements, I can ask your system to do some computation for me, and this will be your form of payment for my service. So you go to my newspaper website, and while you are browsing, instead of bugging you with all these visual stimuli, I can run something in the background. I can mine for bitcoins, maybe not the most efficient idea, but I could still use your computational resources to have it to pay for the fact that I'm producing some interesting content for you. So, and of course we kind of forgot about this idea. I mean, there was even a company in Portugal that was trying at some point to monetize this. I haven't been following up if they were very successful in doing this, but you get the idea, right? So, and then we somehow forgot about this, and maybe a year and a half ago we started thinking, probably not independently. That's, I guess, the fact of a scientific brain. You forget about an idea and maybe link it with something else in the future later on. So we started thinking, okay, how can we use this concept for some other purposes? And we came up with this idea, which I'm going to talk about today. And obviously, this is joint work with a number of my PhD students and actually with a lawyer who helped us navigate through a little bit of ethical and legal aspects of this work. Now, I'm fairly excited about this because I think as a kind of general concept, one could really use or leverage this kind of forced participation in order to improve the anonymity that we have today, or privacy in general. So what is the main motivation here? So the main motivation is an observation that participation in anonymity networks is the key. It doesn't really matter if you're talking about your classic mix or if you're talking about some sort of onion routing. The fact of the matter is that what you really want, you want a number of participants taking part in an anonymity network, because that will improve your privacy, right? Let's imagine that you have a perfect mix that mixes messages and even provides some delays, but if you have only few participants, then based on some timing correlations, you will still be able to infer who's talking to whom at which point in time, right? So essentially, if we could somehow be able to raise participation in different kinds of anonymity networks, we could also improve on privacy. And so the simple issue is that a low number of connected users reduces privacy guarantees, and also maybe somehow more subtle is that if you're building a new anonymity network, you want to bootstrap this network. And so, but if it initially has a very low number of participants, then obviously it's not going to have strong privacy guarantees, and in turn, fewer people are going to also join. So then you will be kind of stuck in this point where you don't have strong guarantees, right? And also on top of it, participation alone obviously raises suspicion. So if you would want to download some content or interact, and if you participate in a particular network, you would indicate that you are potentially, by participation, doing something that may be considered as suspicious, and you might put a kind of target on your forehead. So even this establishment of communication shows some sort of intent, and we also thought maybe this can also be somehow fixed. So what are the application scenarios that we had in mind? Well, typically, if you want to access some documents like from WikiLeaks or those kind of sites, you might not necessarily want to connect directly. You might want to connect through some anonymity network, and you don't want this to be linked to you, right? So you want at least plausible deniability when you are browsing this kind of content. And of course, this is important for democracy in general. I don't have to convince anyone in this crowd why privacy might be important, and also the ability to freely interact and obtain information without raising any suspicion, especially in this day and age where all kinds of laws are being changed in order to even reduce privacy. So one example of that is now that for example the ISPs might be granted access to your browsing history, essentially, right? They might monitor and also sell which sites you connect to, and we don't know where these kind of laws will go in the future. Also, there are questions I think there's maybe in the back of many people's minds. Were you ever afraid to download something that is readily available? So, for example, if you see that something has been put on WikiLeaks, like the latest CIA revelations, are you afraid to just connect there and get the content, right? Maybe some people are not. A lot of people actually don't like doing that unless they're maybe hidden behind Tor or similar services. So maybe someone is actually watching. So maybe you could fix all these problems with what we call forced participation. So imagine that I could compel all of you to start connecting to a particular anonymity network. And if I could do that, then obviously, even if you have an intention of connecting or not, I'm just compelling you to connect, right? You might not want to download the content, you might not want to interact, but I just force you to connect. Maybe I even force you to connect without you knowing that I forced you to connect. And if I do this, that means that I could shield myself from any kind of observations. I could provide both a higher level of anonymity because the anonymity set will increase, but also I will be able to hide my intent, because I also might be one of the entities that has been forced into this interaction. So forced participation is essentially involving unaware or involuntary users in order to join an anonymity network and form a larger anonymity set. And the key point would be to build it in such a way that voluntary and involuntary users are actually fully indistinguishable. So that if I'm participating in this network as a voluntary user and you are participating as an involuntary user, that the adversary could not distinguish between these two types of interactions. And so this would mean the following in our context. This would mean that, for example, anyone who visits CNN.com at the same time starts downloading the content from WikiLeaks. Why not, right? So all that it would take, and we'll see not exactly all, but kind of high-level idea would be that CNN would essentially force you to start downloading from WikiLeaks as well, okay? So CNN suddenly decides that that's a particularly good idea, that as you browse their news, also some information from WikiLeaks, like a weekly update of WikiLeaks, gets dumped onto your system. There were some works in the past, like Conscript and AdLeaks, that actually tried to leverage these kind of ideas for uploads. Primarily, we discovered these works in the last couple of months as well, which and we in what we have done is a little bit more ambitious. So we wanted to extend this idea and study this problem or the feasibility of this for anonymous feed and chat. And I'll show you some of the properties that one can get and the challenges that we faced. Okay, so the main idea there is you connect to CNN and CNN forces you to download or interact with WikiLeaks, even if you don't know that you are doing that or if you don't want to do that. So let's see how this would work. So we imagined the following system. In the end, we built it just to test how it would work, where this is you are a voluntary, or I'm sorry, that's me, I'm voluntary, you are actually involuntary participants, so that's you here. So you are involuntary participants here, you're connecting to CNN, so that's the entry server, and I'm a voluntary participant that has a browser and connects to this entry server. We have two other entities which are called the CoverUp server, I'll explain why we need that, and also the mix server, which you can just consider as a mix. It can be a distributed mix, it can be a centralized mix. I'll talk about the trust assumptions here. Actually, for this particular case, we don't need these entities to be trusted at all. So just imagine this to be a mix. So we have an entry server, which everyone connects to. It can be your university site, CNN. This entry server is going to force all the clients to connect to the CoverUp server. This is essentially just serves them an iframe, which then forces them to go to the CoverUp server. Now this CoverUp server contains a JavaScript. This JavaScript is going to execute in your browser, open a new session to the mix server, and this mix server will then send you some content. So in this case, this mix server actually doesn't really mix communication, but is just provides the feed. So this mix server in this context could be just WikiLeaks that just sends you some weekly update. Okay. So unlike the involuntary participants that actually don't know what's happening because they didn't actually want any content, so they're not even going to look at the WikiLeaks content because everything that is loaded for them gets loaded in the background and gets dumped into the browser cache. The only thing that they see will be, so the only thing that you see will be a CNN page, and then something will be loaded onto your system in the background. However, for me to see the weekly WikiLeaks update, what do I need to do? Well, I need to install an external application that will extract the feed content from my browser's cache. Okay, so in the end, if you look at this, the behavior and also the content that we are getting should be somehow indistinguishable, right? I mean, we are all getting the same content, except that I'm looking into the browser cache and I'm extracting this content. So you might think all of us in the end will get this WikiLeaks content onto our systems. It's just that I will look into that content and possibly store it somewhere, and yours will eventually disappear from the cache. So what do we assume in terms of the adversarial control? So we assume that the adversary can really control fully the network. So he can observe all the channels to all the participants. It can also control the entry server, the CoverUp server, and it can also control the mix server. Now, why is this the case? Well, if you think about it a little bit, you will see that, if I'm a voluntary participant and you serve to me an incorrect JavaScript, well, nothing's going to happen, right? I will get potentially an incorrect content, but I will not be distinguished from the involuntary participant. So this issue of being distinguishing voluntary from involuntary participants, nothing's going to really affect that, right? So the only thing that compromised entities might do in this context, they might launch some sort of a denial of service attack, but in the end, they will still, if they operate properly and just try to analyze, they will not be able to distinguish between different types of participants. And so this is like the basic scenario, right? This feed is so simple and elegant, right, and provides you with a large set of potentially of participants that shield you from this kind of observers. Obviously, here what we assume is that voluntary users' machines are not compromised, and what you also assume is that some usage patterns on the user level, like how many times do you connect a day to a CNN site, as opposed to how many times you would want to read a WikiLeaks feed, cannot be exploited. So that's something that would need to be solved by different measures. So what happens on the system? Well, this is essentially the idea. So if this is your content distribution server, so this mixed server is your WikiLeaks, right? What we do is, and I'll explain why. So let me first explain why we do this. Is that so we were also thinking, okay, if we are distributing some very, very controversial content, might also be illegal content, what we don't want to do is we don't want the involuntary users to end up with this illegal content on their machines, in their cache, right? Because they didn't want that content. Their intention of browsing CNN wasn't to obtain WikiLeaks documents, and we don't want them to even appear in their system. So instead what we do is, so in order to cope with that, what we do is we say, okay, then so the content distribution server, so the mix server is going to take the content that it wants to distribute, and it's going to apply some code to it. Namely, it's going to be fountain codes plus some all or nothing transforms, but with the final result of that, unless you have an external application installed in your system that can grab the pieces of content from your local cache and then reassemble it after a certain time, you will essentially have worthless information in your cache. And this is natural because your cache has limited size, and you can only collect so many chunks in this of this encoded data, and so your local storage will never contain any kind of data, any kind of intelligible data, right? Because because locally, if you look at your cache at any given point in time, you will not be able to decrypt the content. But if you aggregate, if you store your cache, if you copy it every once in a while and then you store it on your hard drive, you will be able to assemble the content. So the idea is really also here relatively simple, to protect the involuntary users from having any kind of information in the system that might somehow incriminate them, if you want. Because you can imagine that if you would do this differently, and that's actually another thing to think about, is if you're visiting my website, I could actually be dumping into your cache, without your knowledge, all kinds of compromising material. Okay? I could be distributing illegal content that can get you in trouble, just by sending you this content without your knowledge, right? Because of course, in your browser, a lot of things happen in the background, and you don't really realize what's being put in your cache unless you are bothered to look. So what we get is essentially that voluntary and involuntary users are indistinguishable, even to a very strong adversary who has this full control of the network, right? And in the end, what you get is that your anonymity set size is roughly the visitors of the entry server plus well, essentially plus you, but you're also a visitor of the entry server. So whoever visits a university site or a CNN site becomes a part of the anonymity set. So now, how would this develop in the future? You know, how would you actually use this? Well, that's why I'm giving this talk today. One could use it in many different ways. So university websites or news websites could actually include small snippets of data. So all it takes is just an iframe that's served, or a bit of Java code that's served, that will provide this kind of service that would connect to all kinds of feeds and then provide this feed to your system. In this way, whoever wants to look can actually get access to this content, and everyone who visits these kind of sites would provide broader anonymity to people who actually need access to that content. It's a little bit of a heavy solution, right? You're forcing many people to connect, but in the end it would work. And hopefully visiting, different kinds of university sites or news sites wouldn't raise suspicion in the first place, right? So maybe one could use, Adrian Perig recently forwarded this to me when he saw this work that we did, and and this is an initiative to create internet noise, right? So if you click on this button, so you go to this website and you click on this button, your browser will start passively loading random sites in your browser tabs. I mean, this is essentially a way to fight against your ISPs creating profiles of you, because this is becoming legal now in the US. So what they want is they actually want to generate random noise in order to prevent or limit the extent of this profiling. Potentially, ideas like the one that I just described could be also used in this context. Now, of course, we wanted to go one step further, and we want to say, okay, now fine, we have a feed, so we have a unidirectional channel from some content server to the clients. But now we want to extend this. We want to extend it to a chat, and we wanted to see how this could be done. So in the context of a chat, obviously we need an upstream channel to the Mix server, and for this we needed to extend the browser with an extension that could handle this kind of interaction. And so obviously there is a JavaScript running which has been served from the server. So initially the external application would launch a request to the extension. The extension would then provide this content to the JavaScript, and this would then be sent onto the Mix server. And obviously now when you get a message from someone else, right, this will be sent to you back through the JavaScript and then through your local storage, and then eventually picked up by an external application. So you can in the end build a bidirectional channel, so not only read data from your cache, but with the help of some small extension you could then extend this whole idea to a bidirectional channel and have a chat. And obviously, why are we insisting on a feed and a chat, right? I mean, I have to be honest, because pretty much everything else would have such a terrible performance that wouldn't work. So I could be here and tell you, well, feed and chat are the most important applications that you would ever need. Maybe not, but using these kind of ideas of forced participation, according to what we have found, at least feed and a chat have sufficiently usable performance for this to work, right? At least in the context of browsers, right, and the ecosystem that we have today. So in a chat, in a chat scenario, we have a little bit different trust assumptions. So of course, we have to trust the Mix fully, because the Mix now acts on behalf of these clients that also transmit, right? So this means that the Mix needs to create also at the side of from the voluntary users and involuntary. So voluntary users will generate their own traffic, but involuntary users need to generate upstream traffic, and this will be encoded in the JavaScript. So if you look at this, involuntary users are only going to have JavaScript, and they will launch requests to the Mix, and the voluntary users are also going to have an external application that is going to get useful content towards the Mix server and from the Mix server. So maybe I didn't explain this well enough so far, but actually the involuntary, we never expect involuntary users to install anything on their system, right? Involuntary users are only going to visit the website, that's it. Everything else will be executed automatically on their system. The voluntary users will install some external applications to make sure that they can signal what they want to communicate to the others. But voluntary users, a JavaScript is sufficient to act as an agent on the side of your machine and generate enough noise, and that's why the system is called CoverUp, to cover my communication. So how did we go around about evaluating this indistinguishability assertion that we made, that really the voluntary and involuntary users are indistinguishable, right? Well, this took a lot of work by my students, as Christoph Parr mentioned this morning. You know, whenever a German professor speaks, I'm not in Germany, but in Switzerland, so close enough, he talks about the work of his students. So I can subscribe to that. So what we essentially are claiming is that the protocol transcripts are indistinguishable. So is this really true, right? So if we take a browser and this browser is only running a JavaScript, as in the case of an involuntary user, and then we take a browser with an extension and a background application, and this system is running, are they truly indistinguishable? So we didn't analyze users' entry server visiting patterns because that's somehow outside of our scope, but what we wanted to do is measure execution time by network timestamps. And we actually really wanted to analyze the worst case scenario. So we literally took two machines that they didn't run any process except for a browser with a JavaScript and a browser with an extension and an external application, essentially running either voluntary or involuntary users. Am I running out of time, Ahmad, or what?
No.
Okay.
Make a sexy picture.
Okay. Just tell me when, because then I can. So we initially, what did we initially do? We just measured those, right? And you can see here, so we measured two things, right? First was, from the moment that you actually receive the JavaScript, how much time does it take for you to initialize your interaction, to start your interaction with the system? So this was the first thing that we wanted to measure. And the second one was, after you are running and interacting with the mixed server, we built a service that runs at a certain pace, because then obviously it's indistinguishable whether you send a packet or not, right? So these kind of correlations cannot be made. So we have a load time, right, which is the initialization stage, and then we have periodic interactions from these clients. So we wanted to now see whether in execution and initialization can be distinguished. So the above here shows you the difference between a distribution of these times for voluntary and involuntary users, and here below, this is for initialization. And as you can see, actually, they can be fairly easily distinguished. And this is because of potentially of our pretty bad implementation. I don't know, because my students implemented it, so it's because of their bad implementation. That's what I keep on telling them. Maybe they will improve. So we saw that there is a difference. And obviously, you can optimize on the implementation, right? You can now build your extension to be better. You can also somehow tighten the interaction between the external application and the extension. So all these things can be done, and maybe these distributions will look slightly better, slightly closer, right? The main issue here is not necessarily only the shape of the distributions, as we will see, but it's actually really how wide they are, right? So you want to make sure that they're at least in a similar range. So here they were clearly distinguishable, right? Especially that they were distinguishable. If you look at these numbers, this is in milliseconds, and if you look at TCP timestamps, you can see. And again, we are taking a very, very strong attacker. He sits on your local network and interacts with two identical systems. Nothing else is running here except these processes, right? So he can actually tell them apart, both for in execution and initialization phases. And of course, it can be fixed, right? So how do we fix it? Well, we add some uniform noise. So we take these two. So within a JavaScript, we just add noise, and this noise can be made such to essentially cover the width of this entire time that within which we can observe the difference between voluntary and involuntary users. And now if you add this noise and you start and you do some calculation in terms of the ability of the attacker to distinguish, and you express it in terms of false negatives and true positives, what you get are these kind of curves for feed and for chat, right? So essentially anything above 0.5, so 0.5 is a guess, right? So it indicates a guess of the adversary to break this system. So anything above 0.5 is essentially the so between 0.5 and any number that you pick is the adversary's advantage in distinguishing between the two, or better say, expresses the error of distinguishing between the two. So and here is essentially the width of the distribution in seconds. So we see here that, you know, if we just want some plausible deniability, we could impose 3 seconds of noise, and for in execution the feed would leak a little bit, the chat would leak sorry, the initialization phase would leak a little bit more. But if we are a bit more conservative, around 12, we are already getting some relatively reasonable numbers. But in the end, if you tighten these numbers, and if you go for, let's say, 10 or more seconds, or even 60 seconds, you will get a pretty good numbers in terms of distinguishability. So the adversary would not be able to guess. You add a little bit of noise, right? Of course, noise impacts performance. This is nothing new, right? Because as the more that you add of this noise, the pace of your communication is slower, and therefore you will be able to have less bits per second communicated. So there is also, so this is just to give you an idea of, you know, how much of this noise do we have to add. But then there is also something called the privacy budget, because over time, so sorry, I have to go back here. So you actually leak some information, right, at different points in time. But then as you progress, right, as the adversary collects more information about your interaction, of course he would aggregate more. He would become much more comfortable with his distinction between you being voluntary or involuntary users. So because he collects more information, right? And we wanted to test this, so we looked into the number of observations, how it scales with the adversary's ability to distinguish between the two types of systems. And if you think about initialization, let's say that after 2,500 initializations, this corresponds essentially 2,500 times that you have actually launched the browser and started this and interacted with your entry server. The adversary's ability to distinguish would be 0.58, so 8% more than a lucky guess. And for in execution, of course, it's much longer. He needs 20,000 of executions. And so these numbers, when you put them all together, you see that that if you take average use, that you would be somehow fine over a year, for example. So if you take a year of interactions with such a server, the adversary's ability to guess tell you apart would be roughly 1% above a lucky guess, which is pretty good. So of course, you know, you can tune these numbers and play with them, but these are all covered in the paper. So the performance, overall performance that you get from a session of 10 minutes, for example, 10 minutes of browsing at CNN, what you would get a 75 kilobyte packet every 30 seconds. And this is kind of decent enough for a chat application. So of course you can say the latency really bugs me because I need a faster rate of communication. But then of course you can go back to those curves and tighten things up and then get a little bit worse privacy, but at a faster pace of communication, right? Okay. Now the overhead is something that I didn't really talk about. but if you think about the overhead with 10 connections a day, it's around 165 megabytes a month, which is also the penalty paid by the involuntary users. So the question, of course, is when you go to CNN.com and CNN suddenly starts sending you a lot of content that you don't want, your question would be, how much am I downloading that I shouldn't be downloading? So obviously it depends on what CNN decides to send you, right? It can be quite a big chunk of data, right? In this case, the overhead would be, as you can see it here. Of course, we implemented it. You can see here what the implementation entailed, right? You can play with it. You can launch a chat. You can go to our test. I mean, it will connect to our test website that will then connect you to this mix, and then you can play with this system. Okay, so the fun part for me in this kind of a project was actually really ethics and legal as well. So the ethics part. Is this ethical? So when we submitted this to a conference, we got a strong reject by one of the reviewers saying, what you are doing is unethical. So this was the first sentence in the review, and you can imagine how it went from there. I mean, it didn't go super well, right? So, and it depends how you approach this, right? Of course, you can do this in the way that cookies are being served. You can say, well, this website uses cookies, or this website, improves anonymity. Do you want to take part in it? Yes, no. Or you could do it with some sort of an opt-out, or you can have it in a browser disabled or enabled by default. That's a question, right, that you can ask. But one of the main things for us somehow in judging whether this is ethical or not was, will the users be harmed in some particular way? And so we judged that the computational overhead is negligible, and that also the data overhead would be minimal, at least for the types of applications that we had in mind, which is a feed or a chat, right, that serve you small chunks of data and wouldn't burden your system too much. And obviously, if you compare this to advertisement networks and tracking services, you will see that they already load loads of data onto your system. When you load a web page, there are already megabytes of data being loaded in the background. For advertisement, movies are being played automatically, music is being played, and also advertisements are just being run in the background. So this is not so different from that model, except that in this case you can say, well, we are using it in order to increase the anonymity of systems. Now, legal. So we went to the lawyer, and that's why this slide contains so much text. But I tried to highlight the most important parts. So he focused actually on the convention of cybercrime, and he highlighted 3 different issues. So one issue was illegal access. So illegal access penalizes the entering of a computer system. And you might wonder, and this is why I started with this sentence at the beginning, saying anyone can run code and make connections from your system. Practically anyone whose web page you visit, right? So the question is this harm? Is this something that we consider entering someone's system and doing harm, right? And we had to kind of look at this and analyze it not only for the purpose of advertisement networks and others there, because legal cases were made on that, but actually for this particular functionality. So his assessment, and this is one lawyer, right? I mean, law is something decided in courtrooms and across many jurisdictions, but his assessment was the following. So that the download of JavaScript from the server is standard browser functionality for communication, and the same would happen if the entry server were financed by online advertisement. So he didn't find this to be a case of illegal access. Of course, he needed to sign a contract with us, which means that if this is incorrect and if we lose in court, he represents us for free. So it's all good. Data interference. So it penalizes the damaging, deletion, deterioration, alteration, or suppression of computer data without right. And so we wanted to, and so what his arguments were here, and we really left him to run independently, right? Honestly, we didn't kind of pay a lawyer to argue our case. We wanted to honestly ask him, is what we are doing somehow illegal, right? And we would have still published the paper, it's all good, right? we are discussing the properties of a system, but we wanted to know this. And so he said that what he's saying is that code is malicious if it executes harmful function or if its functions are undesirable. And so the question is this function undesirable is something that we, in the end, it's a question of judgment, right? And this function shouldn't be undesirable, right? It should be desirable to help some anonymity system. And then in the end, it was the misuse of devices, which is the third issue that he raised, which penalizes the production, making available, or distribution of a code designed or adapted for the purpose of committing a cybercrime offense. And this was in relation to us essentially distributing this Java code from our server in order to activate some other devices to distribute some data. And so of course this is a question of dual use, and since the system was not produced for offensive purposes and make sure that content is only available to voluntary users, somehow he deemed that this is not an issue here either. So in summary, I mean, forced participation is something that I really like. It's something that I'm wondering, and that's why I wanted to give this talk and not talk about other things that I usually do, is I kind of like it as a concept, right? That we do have inherently in the structure of our browsers and the internet in general, we do allow some sort of interaction to happen by default, and also some interaction to be imposed on us by other parties. And it can be used for good purpose, abused for some purpose. And this is one example where I believe it can be used for some good. And I actually wonder if this idea can be generalized to other problems and properties, right? One I just mentioned earlier. Micropayments was another that we thought about in the past, but maybe there are others. I don't know, right? I'm trying to think about this, and I hope that I inspired you. So before I conclude my talk, I need to say two things. So if you're excited about any of these topics, these are some other things that I do that I love doing with my students. They are slightly different from the topic that I presented so far. So like GPS spoofing, distance measurements, location-based authentication, trusted computing, and so on. If you're excited about these topics, I'm always happy to talk about those and the results that we made there. And obviously, I live in Switzerland. I happen to be a director of the Zurich Information Security and Privacy Center, which is a large center, about 65, 70 people doing security at ETH in Zurich. And you can, of course, we always have open positions for great people. We're always happy to interact. If you want to find out more about our center, please go here. There's an awesome video here by someone that you can also watch. So we have a bunch of videos of talks and interesting topics that we cover in the center. This is a center that's actually set up between the industry and ETH in Zurich. So we have a number of industrial and governmental partners involved, which makes this interaction actually quite interesting and for us very exciting. So, and with that, I will conclude my talk and happily take questions. Thank you.
Questions? One there, one here.
Thank you very much for your I'd like to go back to the legal issue that you were talking about.
Maybe turn on the mic.
It's better? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. This one is very interesting because many years ago I was thinking about this, and then they come out with this cookie authorization, you know. It's something they leave on your computer. So the question is, to who belong really my computer? Is my computer, my hard disk space, is my hard disk space, or is something I am sharing with somebody, and I don't know exactly what you are saying. But in an ideal world, when I install some application, forget about now what you are telling, the sharing of information unwillingly. But let's say in more generic case, if I don't want that anybody use my space without my consent, this will be very difficult. Let's say I use a trial version of software. When I delete it, you should not remember that on my computer you were installed something. So if I try again to install the same version for free for another 30 days, I should be able, because you should not.
I understand.
You should not
so you're
get
talking about
my information.
Talking about really, I mean, they will try obviously to hide something on your system, right? If that's the easiest way, or they will try to send some information from your system, essentially, right? They will try to profile your system to know that it's installed a second time. But I mean, this issue of not allowing, I mean, look, I'm not a lawyer, but it just breaks functionality, right? And I think the laws here, if you say my cache will be 0, sure, you can try to build such systems where your cache is 0, but you're still, allowing certain things to be stored in your system. I don't think that's avoidable, as you mentioned, right? I mean, you cannot avoid things being stored in your system because it's a part of a functionality, right? You would now need to kind of compel every developer to be careful about storing any data, even temporarily, on your system. And now, God forbid that you run out of memory and something is swapped on your hard drive. I mean, then he's violating all kinds of laws and regulations, right? So this would be a really hard thing to do. And I don't have a good answer there, right? I mean, all these remote executions are done for a reason, and it's mainly functionality. And then, here I see some opportunity to do it, and
you just click accept when they ask you, and
I don't think you click accept. I think when you install a browser, you kind of accept.
This will become an issue. This will become an issue in the future, they just can ask you to accept. As like they would the cookie today.
You provide 503 pages of tightly typed text, and you ask people to accept, and and you hope for the best.
Okay, this gentleman, and then that one, where are the actually students that should run? I'm doing it all the time.
So, so I'm Abdul from Carleton University. So I have a deployability question. So what motivates websites to implement something like that? I mean, this is a typical system that I guess benefits as more websites employ that. So what would be the motivation for websites to do it? And secondly, how would the WikiLeaks, for example, is an obvious example, but how would other websites be chosen? Because otherwise, people will be trapped into the 1 or 2 or 3 or that few set of websites to anonymize.
So for the feed, it could be a. So first, to answer your first question, so the motivation, we thought about what we could say there, and I'm not sure if we can actually say much beyond that. It's really specific to a particular domain. Like if you take WikiLeaks, people might have, or websites might have specific opinions, or companies might have opinions whether to go down that path or not. Depends on their customers, right? I mean, they might say, we don't want to do that because our customers don't want to support WikiLeaks, right? And but if you're talking about the university site, actually we talked with our university, and they don't mind doing this, right? And we are now, when we polish this we will start to test this at ETH. We will deploy it on the website, so come and visit our website. And now, of course, we need to see with the lawyers at the university if they want to include this kind of explicit acknowledgement, or if there's some opt-out process, or if you need to put a warning sign somewhere or something like that. But that's a good question. Incentives are very hard. They're outside of the technical domain. I mean, I would love how to answer that more systematically, but it's really a question of. Also, there is a question of whether universities are comfortable. For example, I'm giving this example of WikiLeaks because it's probably kind of the best known, but it can be any other content, right? I mean, my first idea was just to put my picture on everyone's computer, whoever loads, whoever goes on the website of ETH, right? I mean, which will probably be a test case, like we just want to distribute my pretty face everywhere. So yes.
So just a second question, really quick. So in terms of identifying, like from the attacker's perspective, have you looked at the patterns at which users spend on websites like WikiLeaks, for example? Because typically I download a page, I spend maybe 10 seconds scrolling through, and then, so those patterns could be a point of attack as well. So have you looked at something like that?
So we looked, so if you now use like the chat example as a bidirectional channel, then you can actually indicate what you want. So you could potentially even sort of browse, but it has to be quite limited. So it's not full browsing mode, because obviously this is a very slow channel. But if you're talking about WikiLeaks, we are talking about a feed, right? So it has to be some sort of a subscription mode, so it cannot be fully interactive. So it will be coarse-grained, but that's about it as far as we manage to make it work. But again, we are working on the performance, and if the performance improves, then we could see more functionality. Conceptually, it's there, but performance-wise, we need to boost the performance.
The talk event great. My name is Hung from National University of Singapore. The talk event great. The idea of forced participation for privacy is actually really, really interesting. But I have two concerns about the technical side. The first concern is that throughout the analysis about the security, I do not seem to recall you talk anything about the external application. Now, the one thing that can distinguish between the voluntary and non-voluntary participant is that on one hand, one guy installed the external application, and on the other hand, the other guy do. So is it possible for the attacker to somehow track the application and see if that guy installing that?
Sure.
I'm not so sure whether it's possible.
So this is look, we can't get out of this assumption, right? Of course. Actually, we can in one very kind of simple way, and this is that. Let's say that this application could be a part of your feed as well. Initially, if you're an involuntary user, you could even manually go and search in your cache and get something out of it, right? But we didn't want to go down that route. We just made a simple assumption that you got an external application through some out-of-band or some channel that's unobservable, and this is a one-off. Right, you have to do it once. It's not continuous process, right? But it's true that if someone captures your system and now inspects it, sure, they will observe such an application. That we don't defend against those kinds.
The second minor concern is that perhaps the distributing server is vulnerable to DOS attack. Now, whosoever connect to the entry would also be rerouted through the other one. So it might be not a big problem, but the indirect DOS can happen.
Sorry, I didn't get that. What can happen? A DOS to the. If you want to DOS that system, sure. I mean, you can. Of course, you can try to bring it down, right? I mean, this is. I mean, DOS in general is not easy to prevent, but. You're right. I mean, if you want to DOS the system, it can be done, yes.
So before Yongdae asks, could you please send a microphone there, please? Yeah.
But he needs to have as many, I mean, the connections need to come from those users. So, and there has to be an agreement between let's say, take for example, WikiLeaks, right? If you want to get a feed from WikiLeaks needs to somehow agree with CNN that there will be connections through CNN. You can always go directly and try to attack WikiLeaks, but through CNN should make sure that only those clients that connect are forwarded to WikiLeaks.
Okay, Yongdae.
So I'm not sure if I'm missing something, but what could be the challenges if Google or Google products like YouTube and Google Maps decide to run this?
Yeah, I mean, good question, right?
Does it solve all the problems for you? Because, I mean, if it is just one site and Google basically said, okay, we're going to support this anonymity, privacy, and...
Well, it's only his picture, so it's...
So I mean, you can... Actually, that's a good question, but you can ask this question even in a different way. You can say, well, what happens if now suddenly any kind of app developer of a widely spread app or a website would decide to do this in the background on top of its primary functionality, right? What would happen? I don't know. I mean, one could explore that, right? I mean, how much can kind of dedicate to some anonymous or other or communication or some other good cause, if you want, right? Yeah, good question.
Yes, Vincent Lenders from Armor Swiss. Is your system working if the clients that browse the internet have an ad blocker? Because many people today have an ad blocker in the browser to prevent actually third-party downloads. So is it still working or not?
So you need the iframe to be loaded, and then you need the JavaScript to be executed. So it depends on what your ad blocker blocks, right? Then if it would block that kind of functionality, then no. But if it wouldn't, then yes. I hope that answers your question.
Right, but okay. So but basically,
we didn't test against existing ad blockers, so I would have to go through them and see if they would block this. But I don't know. Can you guess based on what I said? Yeah.
So the CNN kind of website here, will it be held accountable? Especially if you're saying that for example, it's actually playing a role in hiding your identity or identity of the person. So it could be held accountable. So let's say it's a local website. Let's say it's and people browse it regularly, like a news website, like CNN, for example. And it's in a country that doesn't allow you to go to illegal or explicit content, for example, that are outside the borders. In this case, this local website whoever is voluntarily accepting this kind of code could be held by law accountable, right?
So I can tell you it's even worse, because if you look at the full picture, CNN only reroutes you, but then the content is provided by some third party. So this means that essentially I'm only forcing clients to connect, but I'm not even responsible for the content. So it might be even worse, right? It might be that I'm now kind of complicit in the distribution of something that I don't even know what it is. It might be child porn, right? It might be super illegal, and it's being downloaded on people's systems, and you are somehow assisting in that kind of an operation, right? So it's in terms of legal setup, it's even trickier, right, than what you just mentioned. But obviously, this is a question of agreement between sites, right? You're not going to redirect to just about anyone, right? You need to redirect to those where you think that some benefit could come from.
Yeah, just a note there. There was a case actually. I'm not going to mention the country, but there was a country where they allowed users to be exit nodes. And when one of the cases that led back to one node that it didn't know what kind of Tor traffic went through its website, just the fact that it's allowing itself to be an exit node for Tor incriminated that person. That could be the same, right?
Again, I'm not a legal expert, especially not in all jurisdictions, so this would really depend on the jurisdiction of the country that you're talking about, right? There are different court rulings in different countries. The analysis that was made here was made for US, European Union, and Switzerland. So that's what we got the feedback on, right? And what this lawyer cited were around 15 cases that were ruled on in those three jurisdictions, right? So I have no idea, and things are obviously always changing, like Ahmad was mentioning Brexit. Now maybe the UK will change some laws in 5 years, and then you have completely different regulations down the line. So I can't answer this question.
Roland Yap from National University of Singapore. I was just wondering whether this scheme might make it easier to do censorship, though.
To censor people?
Because it may be easier to censor the content then.
It would be easier to censor content because you are receiving it also through a feed?
Yeah, correct. So
you can always access it directly, right? I mean, look, you can say, if you say my only source of information is WikiLeaks, then you would be censoring yourself, right? No? I mean, you're saying that you're...
If the attacker wants to censor.
If the attacker wants to censor, what would he do?
Just censor the mix site, right?
That if he's in full control of the mix and he doesn't deliver the... I mean, we have usually integrity mechanisms to detect this, right? Because when you distribute the feed, there are timestamps and there are you append a signature, and that could easily be detected, right? I mean, there is an expected feed, and if you don't receive it, you have numbers, you can hash back and so on. So I I don't expect these issues to be easily, but it's a good point. We didn't explicitly analyze it, but I'm not sure that it cannot be solved.
It's the flip side, so it's different.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so not.
Good question.
He was a bit faster.
Yeah, maybe you have already said that. Is the code open source?
Yeah, it's there if you want to check it out. Talk to my students again. I'm excited about this and also about other uses of this. So it's a little bit of a, also for me a new kind of topic. So I'm happy to see that many questions. So thanks for that.
Hi, Eugene Koldenker from Boston University. So technical question a bit. You said that for the chat application, there has to be trust with the Mix server. Is that to handle the routing as to which willing user actually sent the message and requested it? Or what was
Yes,
the reason for the
exactly.
trust
So
in
you
the Mix server?
could exactly that. So I think that's a very good point. I didn't have time to get into that, but essentially when you receive all the messages into the mix, right, you need to know to whom to route them. And so an obvious straw man would be to broadcast to everyone, but this would be too expensive. So we didn't want to go for that solution. It could work in a small scale, but that's exactly the point. That's why we assume the mix to be trusted in order not to have to broadcast every message to everyone, right? Is there a smart way around it? Yes, you can build like a distributed mix and then things could be better. For now, we just have an entity called the mix now. Yeah, but thanks for that question.
Thank you.
That gives me time to. Come on, Ahmad. I mean, I'm now you're torturing me. I'm now.
What you know? You're tired.
Good. I'm tired.
Please wake up. We have so much time today.
I'll be also here during the coffee break.
Until Ross talk, we have around 3 hours, so you can ask all questions you have in life, comments, personal, non-personal, ask questions. Personal questions. Give me a microphone.
You want to see
Introduce yourself.
aired in public.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, Ali, KTN Research Center. How did you determine that you need the 7 point something megabyte per day for every?
That's what we were able to get, right? I mean, so if you, I mean, this, you mean how? You mean this overhead? How did we calculate it? Yeah, this is based essentially if you have a constant rate mix, which essentially sends a packet every few seconds, determined by the interval that I showed here. Then when you add all these things together, so you have the initialization, and if here you have in execution periodic packets coming in and out, that's what you get, right? And of course now you have to multiply this by the minutes that each user uses, and for that we looked into the usage patterns in regular usage patterns for shopping sites and news sites and so on, and you can see that people spend on average, let's say, 10 minutes browsing some sites. And of course, these are all numbers, depends on the type of a site, and now you can extrapolate how much traffic this will generate for an involuntary user. That's it. Because the moment that you close the tab, this stops, so your part in this stopped.
Serjan, you can continue? So if there is no other question, Jean, any question? No? Want to know where the swimming pool?
I think Jean can always find me.
Exactly. Serge, but Jean has also a talk, so we can ask him as much as. So if there is no other questions, then I would say we thank Serjan. Thank you very much. So the next invited talk will be around 17:30, so it's 5:30 p.m. And today, not tomorrow. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry, there is one before. No, hello? Does it work? Okay. Okay. Ramesh, can you please remind the people that there is a talk now outside? I just announced another talk. Okay. Gino, you ready?
Almost.
Okay. So please, I hope that you are still fresh and fit for the next talk. Unfortunately, I announced the last talk of today before Ross Anderson's talk. So Gene Sudek, I think everybody should know Gene Sudek. He is a long-term name in this community. I think the first time I had an experience with Gene, he was the program chair of Public Key Cryptography Conference, and they rejected my paper. So I sent a complaint email to him, and he said a very rude answer to me back. I don't want to say it here. And then I learned you can't make fuss with Gene, and from that moment on, I was much more careful with Gene. So now we are very good friends. So Gene has been doing a lot of research in different areas, not only in key exchange and applied cryptography, privacy, also system security. So, and he's going to give us some new line of research that he's pursuing, and I hope that you're going to enjoy it. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it.
Thanks very much. I always appreciate the brief introduction. Nothing more boring than hearing your own bio. But I have to say, there's a veiled compliment in this introduction, because he said that I'm like a long-term member of this community, which makes me sound really old, which maybe I am. But his memory is not as good as mine. We didn't meet at PKC whatever with a rude answer. I met him when he was a PhD student at another student's defense, and there was way before that. So at least somebody here is older than I am. But anyway, thank you, and I hope you'll stay awake. I know it's kind of a witching hour for a conference, right? The mid-afternoon after a nice lunch, but we have some daylight, so I hope I'll keep you awake, if not the topic, at least with the daylight here. So just a few obligatory cartoons, just totally gratuitously here to give you the feeling for the theme. So the theme is genomic security, and this is a topic that I've recently started looking at. I've done some work in genomic privacy, as have many other people, and it's been a very vibrant area of research, very timely. But genomic security, as I will try to argue here, has not received its share of attention, and maybe for good reason. So before I begin, I don't have an outline for the talk, because who needs that? But I give you a disclaimer. I am a researcher in security, privacy, and once in a while applied crypto. I've been doing it for quite some time. But what I'm not is an expert in any kind in genomics, genetics, bioinformatics, statistics, or much of anything else. So don't try to track me down after the talk and ask me tough questions about genomics. Okay, I probably will not be able to answer. So, but I will tell you a few things about the basics. Some of you already know this. Basically, what is a genome? It's a complete blueprint for an organism, for a living organism. So this table has no genome. This carpet has no genome. This piece of wood there has no genome. Well, actually it does, sorry. The wood does, but sort of plants and living organisms, right? So any kind of animal, insect, plant has a genome, and it can be sequenced, and many of them, or some of them have been sequenced. But in the context of this talk, I will be talking about human genome, right? So that means I'm a speciesist, right? It's kind of almost like a racist, right? But I'm going to be concentrating on humans, and forget about, because I think their privacy, their security is not all that important. And so pretty much every cell contains a copy of the genome. Not every, but almost every cell, like some hair and nail type cells don't actually contain a good copy, but most other cells do. And you've seen the double helix, probably the structure, or if you haven't seen it on like some kind of a science program on TV or magazine, popular magazine. You should have. It's cute. So it basically is this double strand of 3.2 billion letters. The letters are called nucleotides, and they come from a very small alphabet, A, C, G, T, right? And if you're a person of a certain age, you've seen the movie Gattaca, 97. And if you haven't, really should, right? Because, most of you are geeks. You should see the movie. So again, 23 chromosomes, 22 and then X and Y, and then 3.2 billion of these nucleotides. Now, what is whole genome sequencing? Is basically a process of digitizing the human genome. Actually, any kind of genome, but then it's usually performed by a fairly complicated piece of machinery called a sequencing device or sequence machine. And its goal is to determine a complete sequence of an organism genome. How is this thing stored? Like, again, I remind you we're talking about humans only. So there are certain ways to think about of how it can be represented and stored. The hypothetical, idealistic representation of a genome is about 720 megabytes. That's if you just imagine a giant file with letters, but actually it would be bits, right? Because every letter needs 2 bits. And so by the time you're done, you'll wind up with about 720 megabytes, which is not actually a lot. Think about it. It may have been scary 20 years ago, but today it's nothing. If you look at what the sequencer outputs, which is a series of as many as sometimes 30 redundant reads for every part of the genome. This is giant. This could be more than 200 gigabytes altogether. Right? These are called short reads. So the machine will read something like 100 characters and output that. It's called a short read. And this is, if you do a Google search for FASTQ format, you'll see exactly the text, the ASCII format that is generated by the sequencer. And finally, there is the variance, difference, or mutation format, which basically looks at the mutation. So just the differences between a given genome and what's called a reference genome. Right? And if you know enough to be dangerous, you've heard this term, reference genome. And the current one is the Genome Research Consortium Human Genome 38 Patch 10. I think that's the most current one. If you search for that string, you'll find you can actually download it, FTP it, and stare at it at your heart's content. It's obviously public. And so this reference genome uses the short reads to align. Right? So it uses short reads to align to the reference genome and to note any kind of mutations. Right? And then it basically captures roughly 0.1%. So if the genome is like 3.2 times 10 to the 9th, the 0.1% would be 3.2 times 10 to the 6th. A much smaller number. Right? And this is typically stored in something called VCF file format, which is also ASCII. You can view it as a kind of a textual database or table. And in that file, or in that file format, one SNP or one mutation, single nucleotide polymorphism, is occupying one line, and it looks something like this. I don't know if you can see it. This is just one line. The red just column headings or attribute headings. And this is an example of a chromosome 20, position 14,370 within the chromosome. The ID is somehow, I forget how it's assigned, but the important thing is, see the ref and alt. The ref is the letter in the reference genome, and the A, the alt, is what actually occurs in this one. So this is the mutation. And a file, a VCF file will have many, many things of this type. So the progress in the field has been amazing, and I think, well, it's affecting us all. Right? So this started in the 1970s with the initial attempts to sequence the genome. And in the 90s, we had, the beginning of the 90s, the Human Genome Project started. It went for quite a long time. The first human genome was fully sequenced in 2003. Took like a decade or something. And then by 2010, 1,000 human genomes were fully sequenced. And the cost, so the speed increased and the cost went down. Right? The original, this is a very rough estimate. $3 billion for the for the first genome, and then to 50K some years later, 2008, 5K, 2009, and now we're having a sort of a race towards $100 sequencing. Now, before you say, but wait a second, I went to 23andMe and for $99.99 they sequenced my genome. No, they didn't. They sequenced parts of your genome. They may yet sequence your entire thing at some point, but they haven't sequenced the whole thing. So there's only parts of it. So I don't think we're quite there yet, but maybe we'll be there like tomorrow, but we're close. But for $1,000 or roughly plus minus a few hundred, you can get it done. I don't know what quality you'll have, right? So definitely price and quality correlate. So now what? So now we have ubiquitous, affordable whole genome sequencing. And that's a promise for very near future. We have some good news. The good news is that we'll have a wider range of efficient and accurate genomic tests. This will undoubtedly improve the benefits and the costs of healthcare. It also facilitates something that the medical professionals love to talk about, the P4 medicine, the preventative, predictive, participatory, and personalized. P4 medicine, sometimes just called personalized medicine. And it also enables these so-called GWASs, or genome-wide association studies, that if you are in the privacy community, you may have heard like a lot of bad things about them, because this is where a lot of privacy leaks occur. And that's the bad news, right? Generally, the bad news is the privacy issues. Now let's zoom in. So P4 medicine, that's basically diagnostics or diagnosis and treatment based on an individual's specific genetic makeup, which is a very different approach to medicine that have been sort of following for millennia. One drug cures all, right? The aspirin approach. Have a headache, take aspirin. Another million people have headaches, take aspirin. This P4 approach is very different. It looks at the individual as an individual and says, what's best for you? Now, it doesn't work necessarily for a headache, at least hasn't yet, but it works for more interesting and complicated and more dangerous things like cancer. So one of the things that are becoming personal, and by the way, the word personalized doesn't necessarily always mean suited to a specific person, but maybe a class of people, right? Like people who have certain mutations, like TMPT mutation, for leukemia, or this famous BRCA2, the breast cancer gene that does not guarantee, but strongly indicates increased chances for getting that type of cancer. The HIV drug susceptibility, then there's breast, lung, and colorectal cancer related to this ERBB2, and there are many others. It also enables all kinds of pre-symptomatic testing for conditions like diabetes, because you can determine some degree of predisposition, adjustment of drug dosage, right? And then prenatal, newborn screening, and there are commercial offerings by 23andMe and known. Now, in the US, this is different from the rest of the world, because in the US, we have some more restrictive rules. So if you've gone through the 23andMe thing outside the US, you probably see a lot more information that is actually health-related, whereas in the US, you won't see anything that's health-related, unfortunately. Then there are genetic paternity tests and maternity tests, and in general, ancestry tests. Right? They trace your lineage. They can be helpful in medicine because they can track family history of like susceptibility of some disease or markers. And entities like Ancestry.com are sort of pioneering this area. Then there are sort of more social, I'd say a little more frivolous things like so-called genetic compatibility tests that look into the chances of a couple, let's say, to produce less than perfect offspring. Or things like allegedly improve your chances of dating, kind of pairing up by compatibility, right? So better dating profiles, things like that. And then finally, but last but definitely not least, is this genome-wide association studies that look at many genomes and look for correlation in susceptibilities and diseases, etc. All right, now the bad news. The bad news is that this is an ultimate identifier, right? It's like a genie once leaves the bottle, you can't put it back in. It's difficult to anonymize it. People have tried to de-identify, to scramble and anonymize genomes for storage in various data banks, and they have failed spectacularly and miserably. And these two results, the Gimrick and Homer results from fairly recent, we're talking about 5 to 8 years ago, clearly demonstrate the complexity or maybe even possibility of anonymization. So these are bad news for privacy. Also, recall that it's a blueprint for you, right? The individual human. So it carries a lot of information, but not just about diseases, but about your ethnic heritage, your let's say migrations of your ancestors, phenotypical traits, including some physical appearance traits, and they've been perhaps overblown. I'm not the right person to make to offer an opinion, but perhaps overblown fears of what's called geneism. This is not referring to my own name, but rather, this discrimination based on one's genetic makeup. As we humans have not really exhausted the ways to discriminate against one another, right? So now we're just going to look at each other's genes. So this is nice. What's the bottom line? This ubiquitous sequencing is here. It's here to stay. Genome is a unique identifier of an individual. It's generally not modifiable, although if you ask a specialist, they'll tell you that some diseases will change your genome, but not in a way that changes your genetic makeup. There are some viruses that, some infections that can slightly change your genome, but don't ask me any details because I actually don't know which. It's a goldmine of the most personal kind of information. It reflects all kinds of things. And remember, it's 3.2 billion letters. It is also the ultimate biometric. Isn't that nice? Right? Nothing could be better in terms of precision than your DNA. So what do we have in store? How about this? Lick to unlock iPhone with a built-in sequencer. I think this will be coming to the Apple Store near you. Let's call it iPhone 45 at only $3,099.99 with a 5-year contract, and lick it to your heart's content. No need to use these pesky fingerprints. You can also sneeze in it. It will sequence you on the fly and let you. But it is also a curse, right? And it's a curse that keeps on cursing. And the reason being that, of course, it's not just your genetic makeup, but the genetic makeup of everyone related to you. Dead, alive, and future. So by, say, revealing your genome, you're basically cursing your progeny, your siblings, your parents if they're alive, and God knows who else, uncles and aunts, etc. No other biometric is like that, right? If you reveal your fingerprints and post them on the web, it doesn't tell anybody about your ethnic heritage, right? And it doesn't tell anybody about your susceptibility to breast cancer or any other, or diabetes. So it's a fairly unique one. Okay, so that was about privacy. I think that privacy hogs the spotlight. Maybe because it's more exciting, right? The threats to privacy appear to be more scary, more intimidating, and spectacular because once a paper gets published that shows how to de-anonymize a whole bunch of publicly available genomes, that gets under people's skin, even if they don't know what a genome is. And the attacks can be of two types. There are large-scale attacks that look at data banks or collections of genomes and try to de-anonymize those, or more personal, targeted attacks that look well, as the term suggests, target a specific individual. So some significant progress has been made against these large-scale attacks. And if you look at the proceedings of various, even security conferences, you will find in view papers here and there showing how to both attack and protect against attacks, these kinds of data banks and GWAS repositories. But new attacks keep popping up, so we're experiencing the typical familiar cat and mouse game. But there's some really bad news that the targeted attacks actually probably have no defense and might not ever have any real defense. Why? Because if somebody targets you, just like in those thrillers and crime dramas, they will get you. If they target you specifically, it's not difficult to obtain your DNA material. You constantly shed it. You leave it all over the place. All of you are leaving it everywhere you go. Right? All of these detritus, the hair, the saliva, the blood, the skin cells, even nail clippings and so on. And so anything you leave behind that is part of your body, chances are, gives somebody an opportunity to get it sequenced and obtain a copy of your DNA. So how can you protect against it? I don't think this will save you. You can buy it. Actually. And let's not forget idiots, right? What do I mean by exhibitionist idiot? Well, it's the kind of, I see the future where the sequencing becomes so cheap that every nincompoop will be able to go and do it for a few dollars, and then they'll be posting segments of this on their Facebook page saying, look at me, I'm not diabetic. Or look at me, I have curly hair. Or I don't sneeze when I am exposed to sunlight. You're wondering what that means. It's one of the things that 23andMe tells you. Like one of those really useful things. They sequence your DNA so they can tell you, do you sneeze when you're suddenly exposed to sunlight? I don't sneeze, according to them. Anyway, so if you want to know more and if you want to look at some serious information, go to this website. It's maintained by our friends at EPFL, Jean-Pierre Roubaud's group. There's lots of interesting literature and pointers. Okay, so what about security? Why hasn't it received a lot of attention? Well, because partly it's kind of in conflict with privacy. On the other hand, it's also kind of the evil Siamese twin of privacy. Or maybe because it's boring. Right? By boring, I mean, it just doesn't excite people. Privacy, leaking your entire genetic makeup, leaking enough information that somebody could actually rebuild you at some point, maybe. That's scary, exciting. Security, what is that all about? Well, let's consider a hypothetical scenario. So we have Alice. Alice is a user, a human. She gets her genome sequenced by a licensed sequencing lab. All right, she goes to a lab, gets a sequence. Now, maybe not goes physically, but sends a sample. Then she gets her genome, she stores it in her personal device. Maybe a smartphone, maybe a laptop. And then something bad happens. Maybe there's malware, maybe some other Trojan, whatever, some piece of software modifies the genome. Or maybe somebody gets access to Alice's device and modifies the genome directly. Or maybe Alice herself decides, I don't like this part about diabetes or this cancer. I'm going to edit it out. So she modifies it herself. Now what? Well, part two, now Alice goes to a doctor. And the doctor treats her for some condition, maybe as dire as cancer. And she gets wrong medicine. Because remember, we have personalized medicine. Maybe she could die sooner. Right? Because wrong medicine is administered. Or she gets admitted to a hospital in emergency, and again, the hospital tries to determine which treatment to give to Alice, and based on her DNA, or certain markers in her DNA, they administer wrong treatment. Again, she could die. Or something more innocent, Alice takes part is mandated to take part in some parentage test, like maternity, paternity, whatever, and wrong result is produced. Or she submits her genomic information to a dating app and gets paired up badly. Disastrous relationship, right? So these are, yes, hypothetical scenarios, but I think at least some of them are scary. Maybe scarier than privacy. Would you rather, like when you're admitted to a hospital, when you're treated for a serious medical condition, what would you rather have? Appropriate treatment or privacy? I think when it comes to that, I think most of us would say appropriate treatment, right? The hell with the relatives. And their privacy. So what about security issues, more concrete security issues? So these are just some questions. Who sequenced the genome? It has to start at birth. And I don't mean the birth of the individual, I mean the birth of the sequenced genome, right? Somebody has to sequence it. Who sequenced it? Can we trust that entity? What is that entity? Is that an administrative entity like Illumina or 23andMe? Or is that maybe in a little more distant future, a piece of hardware that is really like attached to our phone, a part of our smartphone? Yeah, I don't mean lick to unlock, but something like that, something that is a mini sequencer. And there are actually manufacturers, I think in the UK, I've seen something that actually attaches, it's not very small, but some attachment to a smartphone. That is indeed maybe not a very precise, but some kind of sequencer. So what is that entity? Who certifies that entity? Who should certify? Was the sequencing itself done by the book? Was it legally done? Is there a chain of evidence, a trace of some sort that says the owner consented to get her DNA sequenced by this device? Was the sample otherwise legally obtained? Maybe the owner hasn't consented, but it was done by the law enforcement or by border control. Okay? What about evidence? Was there, in case of errors, and errors do still happen. They might not happen in the future so much, but today sequencing devices produce errors. So sometimes there's a need to go back and audit them and maybe resequence. So then you have to maintain raw data, and that has to have integrity and authenticity. What about the central thing, which is the modification of the gene, right? Once it's been sequenced and maybe it's authentic and all that, but if somebody tries to modify it, how can we prevent, detect, act on it? Does it belong to the claimed owner? Maybe I have an authentic copy of Alice's genome, but I bring it in and I decide to pretend to be Alice. So somehow maybe this should be tied to my identity. So that means that we have to consider the owner as part of the equation. And then last but not least, who has the rights to see what? If you go to a podiatrist, maybe that person doesn't need to see your cancer markers. Or if you go to a psychiatrist, they really can look at some parts of your genome that correlate to your brain, but maybe not other parts of your body or other characters. If you're going to a dating site, who knows what they need to look at? But basically it comes down to this: how to authorize and certify and authenticate such entities, right? And give them, essentially it's an authorization, certification, trust problem. How do you establish trust in them? I don't have answers for these questions. These are just questions. So let's look at the stakeholders here, the entities. So somewhere behind, there may be a cloud provider. And maybe some of you are already thinking, why are you talking about individuals having possessions of their genome? Isn't the trend, isn't going to be the cloud? Well, after all I've said, do you still think the cloud can be trusted? We can't trust the cloud with privacy. Should we trust the cloud with integrity and authenticity of millions of genomes? I don't think we're on a solid ground there. So it may yet wind up being the case that the cloud, some mythical cloud provider, will wind up being the repository for individual genomes. But I certainly hope it's not the case. There has to be some higher authority. That may be a world authority, a national, probably national authority. In the US, it might wind up being something like the Food and Drug Administration that would certify sequencing labs and their behavior and what they're allowed to see and what they're allowed to do with it, and how to retain and how long to retain for information, etc. But the three main entities would be the sequencing lab, the user, the human, and then some kind of an entity that perform the test. That could be a physician, it could be a dating app, it could be a law firm that performs paternity, or on behalf of sort of legal profession performs paternity tests, or it could be just something like a hospital. All right, so we have these three entities, and they have different requirements. But now, let's come back and ask the same question. Is there really a security problem? Is the security a problem? And maybe it isn't. There isn't a problem, I claim, if we abandon privacy. So remember the Siamese twin picture, right? So if we just chop this off and say we don't care about privacy, then security is not a problem. It's boring. It really, really is boring. The genome becomes just another file. We know how to protect files, or certificates, or We just sign it. Alice gets her signed genome. She just stores it on her phone. If it's signed with a good enough algorithm and a long enough key by a trusted enough entity, okay, I know that's if. But if all that is true, then we don't have a problem. Alice can just give her genome in its entirety to whomever wants it or asks for it. There's no security problem, right? But if the sequencing lab and tester, right? If the sequencing lab and tester are one and the same administrative entity, that is, if 23andMe starts performing all the medical tests necessary for all the humans, and they are also the giant sequencing lab for everybody, we also don't have a security problem. Because there's just one entity we have to trust, and we already have to trust somebody to sequence it. So that will be that one entity. All eggs will be in their basket. Or if genomic tests and the corresponding regions, and this is now, that becomes a little more technical. So if we could enumerate today all possible genomic tests, and they're not, let's say there weren't that many of them, and we could isolate the specific parts of the genome that correspond to those genomic tests, we also wouldn't have a problem. I hope you can see that. The sequencing lab would produce material needed for a specific genomic test. It would sign that, and we'll have a bunch of signed regions. And if a testing lab wants to see a region corresponding to, I don't know, a colon cancer mutation, we'll say, here you are. Here's your colon cancer part. Somebody else wants to see a hair color part? Well, here's hair color part. It's signed, produced by the sequencing lab, no problem. But unfortunately, that's not the case. New genetic tests are popping up all the time. Their parameters of existing genetic tests change, so we cannot realistically enumerate and fix in advance all parts of the genome that might be needed for all possible tests. And this becomes at least for me, a more appealing setting. Now, the tester and the sequencing lab are distinct entities. Alice and tester communicate over a network. Because if Alice always goes in person to the doctor, and the doctor is the only person that is going to, or is going to entity is going to perform tests, they might as well do the sequencing right there and then. Right? If Alice is there in person, we don't have a problem. But if they communicate over a network, then we have a problem. Plus, test parameters are not prefixed, right? So that's already an assumption made. And so what do we really want? What we'd like is some kind of efficient means. Well, any means would be okay. First, for Alice to convince the tester, that is the entity that is going to perform the genetic test on Alice's behalf, about the integrity and authenticity of Alice's genomic data. Not the entire genome, but the appropriate data. We want to reconcile that with privacy, right? So privacy is back in the picture. That is, we want to reveal to the tester only what it absolutely needs to know. Okay? If it's a paternity test, you only need to reveal actually sizes, not even the contents, but actually sizes of certain segments. Not even the actual content, not the letters. So ideally, the information revealed to the tester, to the testing lab, must not leak anything else. That is unfortunately impossible from the start. And the reason it is impossible is because of what's called genetic inferencing. If you reveal certain parts of the genome, they point at other parts. They essentially imply contents of certain other parts because genome is not random. So we cannot prevent this kind of inferencing, so we just give up on it. There's nothing we can do. But at least from a security standpoint, from a privacy standpoint, we want to give no more of these little letters than absolutely necessary. And we want to do this with some reasonable performance. And this brings us back to the security and privacy conflict. If we assume a compact representation, right? Remember, I told you about 3 different representations. The most compact, the most appealing one is the compact representation that references a reference genome. That means less storage for individuals, etc. Well, if we go with that model, assuming this compact representation with something like the VCF format you saw, for every mutation there's a line or a record, then we have what's called an omission problem. Let's suppose the tester asks for mutations in a range, right? Some range X to Y. Alice can choose to provide some, all, or none. She provides none and claims I have no mutations in this range. Perfectly normal, just like the reference. Or she can say, well, I have one, but not more than one. How do you trust Alice? Now, obviously, she cannot create frivolous mutations, because creating frivolous mutations would require forging signatures by the sequencing lab. But she can definitely omit some. Sorry? So the immediate kind of knee-jerk solution to this is say, oh, well, if you want to prevent Alice from omitting, then sign what's called ranges. Make sure that each mutation is somehow tied to the next mutation, previous mutation. That's with the security 101 approach. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. But let's look at the example. So suppose we have, this is an abstract kind of notation, we have this database with position, or table with position and SNPs, right? Every record there is the position, like Y prime is the position, and the mutation is C. That means in that position, instead of whatever is in the reference genome, we have a letter C. And let's say that each such SNP is signed individually. Let's not worry about how expensive that is, but let's say it's signed. So now the tester asks for a segment of size X, starting at position Y, and with the following parameters. Alice happens to have only one SNP in that range. So she can, if she's honest, she will provide this triplet. It will be this signed SNP. Or she might say, no, I don't have anything. How does she prove that she doesn't have anything? Right? So this is actually similar to something called as a completeness problem in database range queries. That's been studied. Nothing new. So what if we link signatures, right? What if we say, well, let's not just sign them individually, but let's link the signature so that, for example, signature of this on the position Y star includes as a previous record the signature on position Y prime, et cetera, right? So you can think of it as kind of a signed hash chain, just a minor variation on the hash chain, just individually signed links. So that seems like it would work, except it would reveal a lot more. It would require Alice to reveal a lot more than she otherwise would. Because it necessarily requires Alice to reveal not only this, but also this and this. Maybe not the letters, but at least the position. And that doesn't sound like a big problem to you, probably. But remember, well, one of the nicest analogies I heard, and it's funny, I'm actually coming to a place like this, surrounded by a desert, is that the human DNA is like a vast stretch of the desert. Identical, boring looking desert. And then once in a while, there's like an oasis, very far apart. So the distances very far apart, those are the distances between this Y prime and Y star, between Y star and Y double prime. So by giving away this number, this location, and this location, what Alice gives away is potentially significant portions of her genome. She doesn't only give away the fact that the next and the previous mutation occur at these locations. She also gives away the fact that in the vast stretches between, there is nothing, which is information, which is a big leakage of privacy. And so this is not easy to avoid. It would hold for any kind of other representation, like a Merkle tree type or any kind of authenticated data structure representation. And the only way that I can tell you at this point how to avoid this leakage, you might not care. You might say, maybe Alice shouldn't care. I think she should. I think she should. But the only way to avoid it is to revert to full-blown representation of the genome. This is the one that I referred to as the ideal representation, which has your entire genome, the entire 3.2 billion letters, and now somehow authenticating or allowing Alice to authenticate every component of that string, that is every single nucleotide. So is this a problem? Well, 10 years ago, this would have been a real problem. Storing 3.2 billion letters, even if it is 720 megabytes, is not a big deal. But now if we sign every one of them, that becomes a little unpleasant, right? Because, well, let's see, we have something like a decent quality elliptic curve. Signatures will produce, what, 224 bits per signature. And if we sign every letter and 3.2 billion of them, that's a kind of a nasty expansion, right? But it's all right. Storage is getting cheaper, right? So we don't have to do it today. We can budget it for tomorrow. Of course, we could also be smart about it and say, you know, let's not sign individual letters. Let's sign segments. Let's chop the genome into segments and sign segments. But what segments? According to what? According to security engineering practices or according to what geneticists tell us? And even they don't know how to intelligently partition the genome. Because most of the genome is actually a vast unknown to even the best geneticists today. So we can't take this approach. So what we are forced to do is do this. Sign each base letter individually, at least for the purpose of this talk. Okay? So go along with me. Signing is not a problem, I claim. Yeah, producing 3.2 billion signatures sounds awful. But you know what? Sequencing labs, they'll charge it back to the customer. A couple of dollars here and there, nobody's going to notice. The delay, not a big deal. The delay is not in signing. The delay is actually in sequencing. And signatures can be produced by pipelining, and the overhead will be negligible. Extra bits per base letter. There will be, well, if you're using RSA, 2048 at least for decent strength RSA per letter. Again, today may seem scary if you multiply 2048 by 3.2 billion, but 5 years from now, that'll be chump change. What about transmission and verification optimization? Well, okay, now that may become a little more worrisome because the speed of light is still kind of the limit, right? Transmission speed. And verification, well, yeah, okay, still public key operations are not exactly cheap. And remember, if anything has to be done online, it's the tester that has to verify signatures on parts of Alice's genome. So it's his job to perform these verifications. That's what we have to worry about. But we have all kinds of optimizations. So the crypto literature is full of all kinds of little tricks of the trade, starting with batch signatures, right? So everybody knows batch signatures. You basically transmit individual signatures of records or messages, and then the verifier aggregates them and verifies them all, puts them all together by multiplication in RSA or some other methods in elliptic curve, and verifies the whole thing in one big felt swoop. And all it gets at the end is yes or no. Are all of them correct, or is there some verification problem? And since most of them, most of the time will be correct, it's fine. The problem with batch signatures is they still consume a lot of bandwidth because here we have, you have to transmit them individually. Then there are other techniques like condensed signatures, which allow you basically take signatures by the same signer, and here it would always be the same signer, the same sequencing lab, and aggregate them into one before transmission. So imagine again in many records, many of these nucleotides are, each one of them is a message, each one has a signature, but the signatures are aggregated into one. And then the very related concept is aggregated signatures, which are originally designed for aggregating signatures by multiple signers. So it's a little bit of a, not the perfect application for them, but it would work just as well. And the BGLS is the best known example. Those are fine. We can aggregate, Alice can aggregate all of the appropriate signatures into one and minimize bandwidth transmission, bandwidth consumption, and on the tester side, almost nirvana. Then there are everybody's loves Merkle hash trees, right? As the Phillips screwdriver of the computer security world. With the Merkle hash trees, you can imagine the sequencing lab could, instead of signing each individual letter, would build a hash tree. Now it would have to have the whole thing sequenced before the tree could be completed, but it could also build it incrementally as it sequences. So anyway, there would be a hash tree with individual nucleotides being the leaves of the tree. And they would just have a signed root. So for the sequencing lab, it would be just one signature. There will be a fairly bushy tree with depth of about 30, assuming binary. There will be a typical storage computation trade-off because the internal nodes of the tree can be stored by Alice, and if she doesn't have enough storage, they can be recomputed on the fly. There's a well-known trade-off here. The nice thing is very low computational cost for the tester, which are real-time costs, just a bunch of hashes and one signature verification. And one could also imagine using something like skip lists in this place. Nice. But Merkle tree has a problem. So this would be a tree. He has a hard afternoon. Merkle tree, this is a tiny little example of a Merkle tree. The leaves are at the bottom, and they're just, the color is not showing, but there are letters inside, like C, G, A, T, T, A, T, A here. And the tester requests a certain range, right? Certain range of the genome. And then the Alice peels off the appropriate leaves, sends them to the tester along with these nodes. This, what's called the copath, right? Because this is the range. And you need to supply the copath that allows the verifier, in this case the tester, to recompute the root of the hash tree and verify the signature. This is standard MHT verification. So the problem is that if you know these copath nodes, you can also figure out the leaves. Why? Because the leaves are not random. Remember, the genetic alphabet is 4 letters. So if you know the hash of one of the 4 letters, you can figure out what one of the 4 letters is.